Welcome back to Tom's World Scale Model Series. This episode chronicles the painting and weathering of our Tamiya M5A1 Stuart light tank. If you enjoy programming on scale modeling, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Leave us a comment, like, dislike, or share the video with friends. Clicking the notification bell gives you alerts when we post new content, or visit the channel Tom's World for a friendly visit for a complete list of all our videos. In our video build part 1, we undertook the construction of our M5A1 project. The kit was state-of-the-art when it was first released in the 70s, but by today's standards, the model is definitely showing its age. On the kit's tracks, we found incorrectly positioned end connectors, something Tamiya has neglected to fix over all these years. And let's just say that the part fit here and there is a little out of character for Tamiya. But we love an underdog here at Tom's World, so stick with us as we give our modeling skills a workout to coax our little Stuart to a standard that'll pass inspection. In our build video, we managed to get our major sub-assemblies done, and we got the rest of our parts cleaned up in preparation for painting and weathering. Because of the way the M5A1's fender mudguards enclose the track run, completely assembling our model prior to painting would make painting and weathering the hull, tracks, and running gear difficult. And we also had to contend with some rather nasty seams where the fender's attached to the hull. I therefore decided to paint the bogies and wheels, tracks, and the lower hull separately. I can then weather the lower hull and the inside of the running gear. We can then attach the hull to the superstructure, fill the fender gaps, and paint and finish the rest of the model. For my primer coat, I mixed up a raw steel dark gray color. I tinted the color using some old Model Master enamels I had on hand. I used black with a touch of white and rust. I decided on Tamiya's XF62 olive drab as a base color, but I lightened it slightly with a touch of XF60 dark yellow. The hull, running gear, and the inside of the machine gun shield were sprayed with olive drab. Then these surfaces got a coat of acrylic gloss. I prefer to break up flat surfaces with shadows and highlights using oil paints. We'll do this on the upper surfaces. Instead, for the hull bottom and sides, I created modulation with my airbrush. I left some of the dark steel color on the edges of the panels. I then created highlights by spraying a lighter drab color in the middle of the surfaces. It's a nice effect and creates a good base for our weathering layers. This light sienna pigment powder will feature heavily in our weathering, so we want to match its color in oils to use for pin washing and streaking. I'll mix a batch using yellow ochre, burnt umber, white, and a touch of green to achieve the tone. Starting with our hull sides, I begin the weathering process with streaks using oil paints. You can dab on dots of color or simply draw lines like I did. Our tinted light sienna color, as well as yellow ochre, black, and white, work well as streaking colors when applied over top of olive drab. We then remove most of the paint and blend it with a wide brush dipped in mineral spirits. How much paint you leave on is really a matter of taste, but we're trying to mimic the way moisture runs down the sides of a vehicle in real life, carrying with it dirt, dust, and grime. It's a good base, but let's keep layering. Next, we apply a pin wash. We use a little of the light sienna oil color heavily diluted with mineral spirits. We simply touch the brush to surface edges, and capillary action pulls the paint into the nooks and crannies. Then once the oil paint is sufficiently dry, with a gentle dabbing motion, we feather and blend the edges to remove any tide marks. And here's the effect we're after. It recreates the way muck, dirt, and gunk gathers on real vehicles that operate in the field. We'll use our usual trio of pigment powders for this project: the light sienna, dark mud, and light dust colors. For weathering the lower hull, we'll follow our usual procedure. We've covered this process in detail in other videos, so just a quick overview here. First on is our light sienna powder. That's followed by a few sprinkles of our dark mud. Then we flood the surface with fixer. I'm using plain old isopropyl alcohol, but you can use a dedicated fixer if that's your preference. Next are light dust colors applied. Notice that the colors get lighter as they climb up the hull. This replicates the way mud collects and dries on real vehicles in the field. And here's the finished look. The result is a filthy, stained, and grimy hull that any construction site vehicle would envy. But let's take it up a notch. To add stains and splatters, we load up a brush with heavily diluted oils or pigments. And using a toothpick, we pull the brush bristles back and release them to flick on spots of color onto the hull. This process allows us to create realistic splatters that further enhance the grimy and battle-stained look we're recreating. Time to tackle the tracks. I coated them with a flat black enamel. I then masked off the rubber pads and oversprayed the end connectors with a rust-colored enamel. I wasn't sure how well the enamel paint would stick to the vinyl tracks, and although I got the odd flaking coming off here and there, if handled gently, the paint generally does stay on. The pads are rubber, so they're left black, but the end connectors were metal and tended to rust, hence their rusty color. The tracks get the same pigment treatment as did the hull sides. A few dabs of our light sienna, then a few sprinkles of our dark mud, and finally a dash of our light dust color. To avoid unsightly spots, we can gently dab the pigments. This also helps to blend the colors slightly. And finally, we flood the tracks with isopropyl alcohol to fix the pigments. We could use a dedicated fixer, but I find the alcohol works just fine. This process never grows old since it always yields very realistic results. I'm only weathering the inside of the tracks for now. I'll be handling the model quite a bit, so we'll give the outside of the tracks the business near to the end of the build. The tracks that come with these older generation kits are likely vinyl or ABS. Glues do not hold them, so we must melt the ends together. If we look closely at the ends of the tracks, we see two posts which slip into two corresponding holes on the other end. It can be quite difficult to get the posts into the holes, so I stretch the holes first. Here I'm using a dental pick. This makes inserting the posts much easier. And here's how the joint looks once assembled. For as clunky as this assembly is, I must say it does usually result in a strong joint, which is important as we'll see later. We can use any tool to melt the tracks together. I used a stray Allen key. It's metal and long enough so it doesn't get hot when I heat the end with a candle. The tip is just small enough to fit in between the tracks' guide horns. Melting the tracks together is a little fidgety, so I did it off camera. But here's what the joint looks like after melting it together. It's a bit unsightly, but we'll hide the joint behind the fender so there's no need to paint or weather the bare spot. And here's the track length after assembly. I used a flat black enamel undercoat on the idler wheel and masked the edge before applying the olive drab color. We can now remove the masking tape. To create a bare metal polished look, we use a pencil. Make sure you use a soft pencil. That is, the higher the number on the pencil, the softer the tip. We can see this is a 9B pencil, which is the softest available. We can then rub the black edges. We press hard with the pencil to polish the graphite onto the edge. We can then polish it with a cotton swab to really bring up the shine. The result is a convincing, polished bare metal look. The painted bogies, idler wheel, and drive sprocket are then glued to the hull, and once the joints are completely dry, we can slip the track run on. We wrap the tracks around our drive sprocket first, then we gently stretch and coax the tracks around our wheels. It's important to get the wheels firmly attached to the hull since we're putting quite a bit of tension on the tracks to get them on. This is also why our track joint has to be strong. There's nothing more frustrating than breaking off a wheel or having the tracks come apart at this stage. We want to make sure our track connectors, as long as they are, sit in between the drive sprocket teeth, just like this. With the lower hull, running gear, and tracks now installed, we can glue the superstructure to the hull. As we saw in our Part 1 build episode, the little bogie caps that are part of the fenders have to mate with the tops of the bogies. The fit here depends on getting our bogies attached to the hull such that the bogies align with these fender tops. We recall that the instructions tell us to remove the top two bolts off the bogie plate. And here they are. I forgot to remove them, which did create a fit issue. Also, builders may want to file this area down a bit, where the fender top overlaps the bogey plate. This will ensure a nice tight overlap fit. This photo shows how the lap joint should look. Earlier in the build, during our dry fit of the hull and superstructure, we noticed these nasty gaps where the rear of the fender meets with the hull. I coaxed these parts together when gluing them, and a couple of clamps held them in place while the glue dried. Here are the joints after the glue has dried. By pressing the parts together tightly, the generous amount of glue we used causes melted plastic to ooze out of the joint. Once the glue is completely dry, it acts as a filler which we can then sand down. And here are the fenders after filing and sanding. I did have to use a little Mr. Surfacer 500 on the top gap, but once painted the seams will be totally hidden. I then went around the model filling the gaps around the many grab handles and lifting eyes. I used both acrylic putty and white glue diluted with water. I carefully applied the filler with a brush to fill the gaps. Given how deep and cavernous some of these gaps were, several applications of filler were necessary. Turning our attention to the turret, the Stuart has weld beads where the machine gun shield is attached, and also where the front turret plate mates with the turret sides. These are missing on the model. I added the weld beads using thin lengths of stretch sprue. We attach and flood the stretch sprue with thin model cement to soften it. We can then use an X-Acto blade and carefully press the softened plastic to get the bead texture. I glued the pin to mount in place but left the machine gun free to pivot. The friction fit is good, and that way we can remove the gun to paint it. In episode 1 we built our antenna up with a short length of guitar string. Since we're ready to start painting, we can now mount the antenna to the turret. Parts like this are fragile and always seem to break off during construction, so I like to attach them at the last minute before painting the model. With the bulk of the tank assembled, I mounted the remaining parts to card with sticky side-up tape. We'll mask off the bottom of the tank to protect the areas we've already painted and weathered. As I prepared the parts for painting, I noticed that the ammunition box for the 30 cal machine gun had a square hole in its bottom. To cover the hole, I glued a small oversized piece of thin sheet styrene to the bottom, and then I sanded it flush. All the parts that depict bare metal get a flat black enamel base coat. This includes our tools, grousers, and the machine gun. The rest of the vehicle gets our raw steel color. Our dark base coat helps to reveal imperfections, and we can fix them before our final coat of paint. Now's a good time to inspect our filling work on the fenders. Thankfully, they check out okay, as do all the other seams we had to fill. We then spray on our olive drab base coat. This is then followed by a gloss clear coat, which I applied with future floor polish cut with about 25% water. Our decals are applied next. Then we seal the decals in with more gloss coat. It's important to follow the instructions carefully to get proper placement of the decals. Double check your work, since canted decals can really spoil the look of a model. Now we're ready to weather the rest of the model. We repeat the same streaking process as we used for the hull sides. And here's the look after streaking. The pro modeler that I am, I missed two little grab handles in the instructions. I installed them and later color matched them with a brushed on coat of drab enamel. We used more of our mixed light sienna oil paint to pin wash the rest of the vehicle. The light sienna pin wash, when blended, gives the vehicle that characteristic dust and grime on drab look. This is so prevalent in period photos of the Stuart in the field during wartime. Although we'll add pigment powders later, we accomplish a nice dusty gritty look just using our streaking and pin wash. To add more depth and variety to the surfaces, I dabbed on a little black oil paint to accentuate the dark patches. We use very little paint, and with a soft brush we gently blend the color so it feathers into the base coat. The edges of the superstructure also get dry brushed with our black oil paint. We'll rub our pencil over these edges later. We then dab on a little white oil paint that's slightly tinted with our light sienna. This creates panel fading and highlights. Again, we use very little paint and we blend the colors to feather the edges. We want all the different color tones to blend seamlessly together. Here's the effect we're after as illustrated on the turret. We get that caked on dust and worn metal look, and we've successfully broken up and created variety and depth to the otherwise flat panels. Next, we add dry mud splatters along the lower edges of the fenders. We use our light sienna oil color and we don't dilute it so it's thick. We pick a little paint up with a brush which has splayed bristles. Then with a gentle stippling motion, we let the bristles deposit flakes of paint onto the surface. We then remove the wheel mask and now our running gear and the front and rear of the vehicle can be mucked up. And as a final step, we can flick more paint onto the running gear to match the spatters that we created on the hull. And here's the finished look. There are quite a few Pioneer tools to install, 7 pieces in total. I like to pre-paint the tools before installing them. I find it much easier to paint the tools when they're loose rather than stuck onto something. I get better control and don't have to worry about smearing my tool colors onto other parts of the vehicle. Once installed, the tools look great. To finish the machine guns, I'll rub on a little gunmetal pigment powder over the flat black enamel base coat. A rubber makeup applicator works well for this application. I'll finish by adding highlights with my pencil. We dug out our tube of AK True Color brass paint, and we lightly thinned it with mineral spirits, then carefully hand brushed it onto 30 cal feeder cartridges. And finally, I'll give certain edges, the ones that I dry brushed with black oil paint, a few rubs of my pencil. This imparts that dark, glinting look of shiny polished steel to the model's edges. It gives the model weight and gives the impression that it is made of steel rather than styrene. Other than a few final touches, a little dull coat here and there, and maybe a little bit more dry pigment powder, but otherwise our Stuart is finally done. We can now pause for a few benchtop shots to gaze upon our handiwork. And with that, our Stuart is ready for its photo shoot. This model is best judged by one's tolerance for obsolete kit engineering. The nasty gaps around the grab handles, brush guards, and fenders may be off-putting to modelers accustomed to the tight part fit found in more recent releases. The kit's crudely molded machine guns, woefully incorrect tracks, opaque headlights, and overly thick bogie skids also all beg for aftermarket replacement. Although in general the kit assembles nicely, filling the all too frequent gaps was annoying and time-consuming. This kit is fine for a slap-together weekend build, but it does lack the crispness, sophistication, and higher level of detail found in more modern releases. So if you decide to build this kit, hopefully our video will help modelers to navigate its shortcomings. But in spite of all the challenges, our little finished Stuart looks awesome. And with that, the lack of an M5 in my collection is finally fulfilled. And that'll do it for this episode. Check back for more product reviews, unboxings, and builds coming up. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, dislike, or just complain in the comments. Or stop by the channel Tom's World for a list of all our videos. In the meantime, let's make a toast to a great new year. Stay well and all the best.